Right, we're just waiting for the thumbs up for the live stream. You guys let us know. All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us here at our offices at Northwoods House. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. Thank you for braving the chilly weather and for coming out this evening. I think we're having this conversation at a very timely point in South Africa's history. There has been an historic election. The ruling African National Congress has for the first time lost its parliamentary majority, and that is ushering in a new era of coalition politics. And that has many implications for not only the policy and political landscape in South Africa, but also for the lives of ordinary South Africans. So we at the Free Market Foundation, we are policy analysts and advocates, and we have been putting together a substantive response to the policy opportunity that presents itself here in South Africa. We are fond of writing long treaties and essays, and Martin van Staden recently won a prize in Liechtenstein for a paper that he wrote on the Constitution and the rule of law, which is a very deep analysis. This paper is a lot shorter, a lot more visual. We want to present our core policy recommendations to whatever government is formed over the next few days. And 5 years is a long time in politics, and we've presented what we think are some of the most critical policy reforms that need to take place to unlock economic growth and opportunity for all South Africans and to preserve liberty for everyone in this country. So the format for tonight is as follows. My colleague Martin van Staden, our head of policy, he's going to give a short synopsis of this paper. If you would like to grab a physical copy, you're welcome to do so. But for those of you who are watching online, and this session is being video recorded and streamed on our various platforms, you can also download a link on our website to this document. Right, just some basic housekeeping. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session. After Martin speaks, we're going to have just a short panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor. If you could please use the microphones when you ask your question. That's for the benefit of everyone watching at home, as well as for over here as well. And then also, if you could please put your phones on silent. We just don't want to be interrupted during tonight. And we will, of course, have some refreshments after this as well, where we can continue the conversation. Yeah. And I'm also reminded, I have not forgotten that we have a new face with us on the stage. For those of you who don't know Morne Milan, Dr. Milan, he is recently joining the Free Market Foundation as communications manager. So he has an extensive academic background in theology, law, and economics. And I don't think I'm missing any other disciplines. So he brings not only expertise in communications and strategy, but also policy, and is playing a vital role in contributing to our policy output at the Free Market Foundation, including this document that we're going to be speaking about tonight. So very much looking forward to the conversation. We want to hear from you as well about your ideas, your view on how things are evolving here in South Africa. Right, well, that's it from me for now. Over to you, Martin van Staden.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, welcome. It's exciting times, I think, in South African politics for all of us, no least here at the Free Market Foundation. We've spent, it's about 5 decades now, arguing for sensible policy, the policy of freedom. We did it through the peak of apartheid, when there was no economic freedom if you looked a certain way, and we continue to do so into the democratic era. And yeah, in the late 80s, even from the mid-1980s, the erstwhile apartheid government had an appetite for reform, and reform it did. And that's when the FMF played a big role in relaxing many of the regulations that stifled the economic freedom of primarily black South Africans. And this sentiment really continued into the 1990s when we saw many major privatizations of state-owned enterprises. The various boards, the meat board, the bread board, and all those things were abolished, and they were very sadly replaced with a competition commission a few years later. That's another institution we plan to nuke at some stage. But from the late 90s onwards, it became progressively, not immediately, but progressively clear that the national government's appetite for reform was basically over. There were still sensible politicians. We had Trevor Manuel, wasn't too bad. President Mbeki had some huge blunders, but he was relatively sensible. But through that, you could see that the government didn't really listen anymore, and that got worse and worse, certainly into the Zuma era, where saying, listen, you can't have that policy, and hundreds of thousands of South Africans saying, you cannot have EWC. We oppose expropriation without compensation. We oppose national health insurance. We oppose the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act. That all was for nil because the government had decided what it wanted to do and it was going to do it. Because ultimately it had this dominance in parliament. It had that elusive 50% plus one in the National Assembly, and through everything that ultimately let the government to do whatever it wanted except when reality itself intervened. The 2024 election has changed things. Regardless of how the government that is currently being negotiated is constituted, and regardless of how long it lasts, the GNU could last 5 years. It could last until the next ANC leadership conference in 2027. It could last until the next local government election in 2026, or it could last until the end of next month, when that's where my bets are. I don't think this thing has staying power. But regardless of all of that, the fact is the ANC and any other party is not alone able to enforce its will in the National Assembly, and that is crucial. Because even if you have the Doomsday Coalition, to take an example of the far left coalescing around the ANC, the chances of such a government lasting more than a few weeks is also very, very little. The sustainability of these institutions, South African politics is not used to coalition government, certainly not at the national level. So these things are going to be very dynamic, and policy is now in flux. There's a lot more room now to contest the policy space, at least potentially. So we'll see. This is new to us as well. But with the ANC's loss of its kind of ultimate determinative dominance in our politics, we saw and we thought the opportunity was ripe for publishing something like our Liberty First policy agenda. And many other organizations, I'm sure, are going to be doing the exact same thing, pushing, seeing where the cracks are, seeing where the door is open for reform. And it's a very exciting time in that respect. Now, what the Free Market Foundation has always said, and what we will now for the next term continue to say, is that the course to prosperity is charted. It is not difficult, ultimately, to know what works. You just have to cast your eyes outside of South Africa and see what has caused prosperity in the countries that prosper. And the Economic Freedom of the World report, which is published every year by the Canadian Fraser Institute, we are part of their network, and we publish the South African edition every year as well. This shows that the countries that have the freest economies, the greatest economic freedom, and I must dwell on economic freedom for but a second, because in South Africa, elsewhere, people understand what you say when you say economic freedom. In South Africa, people have a completely warped idea of what that means. It does not mean that you own a farm. It does not mean that you prosper. It is not synonymous with flourishing. It means that you are allowed as an individual, as a community, as a business to decide for yourself. That is what economic freedom means, without the government interfering with whatever it is that you are doing. And the countries that respect that economic freedom, or to put it kind of straight. The countries that are the most capitalistic are the countries with the best human development outcomes. This is basically without exception. The UN's Human Development Index, when you look at the deep blue highlighted countries, you will see that all of them rank very highly in this index. So there is certainly a correlation, and our argument is that there is causation, certainly. And the thing that stands out to us, and this is one of the greatest arguments against economic freedom always, is that yes, you want capitalism, you want free enterprise, but that just benefits the rich. You're greedy. But that's also not what the EFW shows us. The Economic Freedom of the World Index shows us that the poorest of the poor, the poorest 10% of the population in countries with free economies earn about 8 times as much as the poorest 10% of the people in the countries that have the most caring governments and the most interventionist governments. Where governments do more, people are worse off than where governments say, we trust you to solve your own poverty. And this makes sense, of course. If you leave someone alone to do their thing, as it were, they will try and liberate themselves, their family, and their communities from hardship. That just follows. Now, South Africa is, the EFW started in the 1970s. South Africa did very poorly during the 1970s and 80s. Obviously, because we had this grand system of central planning and everything. The government was involved, cradle to grave. It determined where you could live, what you could do, etc. And then with the liberalizations of the late 80s and the 90s, we reached our peak into the year 2000. We ranked in the second quartile of economic freedom. I think, we ranked 47th. That was the highest that we ever got in this index. And from there, a steady decline began until last year, where we ranked 94th out of 165 countries. And our trend is very firmly in the wrong direction. We're not hopping higher every once in a while. We are simply trending higher up in this list, and our economic freedom is falling. So this is the chart. This is the policy course that has been charted that shows very clearly where prosperity lies. And that is what our booklet shows. So we have taken the EFW's 5 areas that they analyze in each country to determine what is the level of economic freedom in those countries. And we have taken what we would consider to be relatively key examples of reforms under each area that the government can undertake and implement to, in that area, boost South Africa's ranking, and as a result push South Africa higher, lower down on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, lower down to 1, so that we get a freer economy. So these examples that you'll see in the booklet are not exhaustive. There are many things that the government can do to free the economy, but we've touched on a few. So the first area is size of government. That speaks for itself. What is the burden that our state bureaucracy represents to all of your wallets in your pockets right now? That is what size of government ultimately measures. And there we're saying the unpopular thing, and that is that austerity is necessary. The size of the civil service has to be cut. We need fewer unproductive civil servants, and we need significantly, I wouldn't say we need better civil servants, but let's have fewer civil servants in general, and they should be better at their jobs. We don't see that at all, and that's key. And I think an obvious start to that is that the size of cabinet needs to be cut, because with every cabinet portfolio comes an implied bureaucracy that must support the minister and support whatever mandate they have declared for themselves. And last year, when there was a big furrow around the finance minister apparently going to implement austerity, that never happened. Such a shame. We said that cabinet should be cut from 30 to 10 ministries only, and we found that these ministries are constitutionally necessary. Our constitution is not an entirely libertarian constitution, so we have to concede sometimes. We said that there are about 10 ministries that you can get away with to fulfill government's constitutional mandate. Alongside that, we need a severe reduction in the number of deputy ministers. unless they are strictly necessary, and it's difficult to imagine where a deputy minister would be strictly necessary. But another aspect of size of government is privatization. South Africa started this so well at the end of apartheid. We had, what was it, 4 or 5% growth around that time when the government was saying, listen, we don't know best for the economy. But key entities remained under state control. What is a greater example than Eskom? I think we're all very happy that load shedding seems to have abated for a while, but I mean, if our economy starts to grow again, we're going to have load shedding again, and then the economy is going to stop growing again. So that is unfortunately the situation that we still find ourselves in, even though the lights are on. So we still firmly believe that if Eskom itself is not to be privatized, then certainly the right to generate power must be deregulated, certainly, and if Eskom is allowed to generate power from coal, if Eskom is allowed to have Kuberg, then the private sector must be allowed to generate power from coal, and the private sector must be allowed to have its own nuclear power plants. And there are initiatives for small modular nuclear power in South Africa, but the worry is that the government simply will not allow that if these come to fruition. We certainly don't think that the government should stand in the way of that. Transnet is another example. We would prefer that these entities be privatized outright, but at least progressively government must start shedding its majority stake in these entities so that the private sector can at least determine the direction rather than having political imperatives continue to rule the day. So that's size of government. Legal system and property rights. Very important as well. We recently went on a roadshow as the Free Market Foundation to launch our campaign for Home Rule. That was all about federalism and the federalization of South Africa. Our argument is that South Africa's constitution is a federal one, and that there is a huge amount of scope in the constitution as it stands today for municipal governments, for provincial governments to do far more than they have been doing rather than defer endlessly to the dictates of the central government. And we said that they need to start doing those things. But of course, we do believe in devolution as well. We do not think that devolution should be the focus, but certainly if the central government does take the conscious decision to devolve certain key functions downwards, that would be a good thing. But we also recommend that legislation be introduced that directs our courts to interpret the division of powers in the Constitution in a certain pro-constitutionalist way, rather than the centralist tendency that we've seen, especially from our constitutional court since the 1990s. That should end. And of course, we would like to see the introduction of Section 235 legislation. This is to recognize the right of cultural and linguistic communities to also engage in some measure of self-government, just to ensure that the spirit of the Constitution and all the avenues that it allows for decentralization are in fact taken advantage of. The rule of law, it's said to be a founding value of our Constitution. We don't really see that in practice. But in our booklet, we have recommended that legislation also be adopted that provides some guidance to regulators and also to Parliament to the extent that Parliament can bind itself to say this is how you should engage in the lawmaking process. There should be a minimum amount of days that you allow for public participation, for instance. There should be a requirement for feasibility and impact studies to be conducted before legislation can go through the process of adoption. These things would tend to increase legal certainty, to increase confidence in the process, and we think they will bolster the rule of law in South Africa. And then property rights, of course. Any threat to Section 25 of the Constitution must immediately be abandoned. Currently, the expropriation bill, I think it is now an expropriation act, is waiting for the president's signature. That contains a provision that says that government can expropriate private property without compensation. That is completely unconstitutional currently because the Constitution, I remind you, was never amended. So that needs to be done away with. The government's obsession with redistribution must also become a thing of the past. South Africa has a constitutional obligation to engage in a process of restitution, to take property that was in fact proven to be taken from rightful owners in the past and give it back to those rightful owners. That is a matter of justice that we completely support. But redistribution is nothing more, nothing less than ideology masquerading as a public interest item. So property rights, very key. The next thing is sound money. We don't actually have a lot to say about this because the Reserve Bank has been one of the, maybe the only government institution that actually does its job relatively well. I think you could say the same for SARS, but I will not say the same for SARS. I'll leave that to you. We think the Reserve Bank's independence must be reinforced. The Reserve Bank Act must be strengthened where there might still be weaknesses. And certainly any talk about expanding the mandate of the Reserve Bank to other public interest things like unemployment and so on, that talk must immediately end. The Reserve Bank must look to the value of the currency, and that should be its only focus. Freedom to trade internationally. This is the kind of the cheat code, as I've described it, to development. Free trade is the real catalyst for growth. We've recommended that tariffs and so on that have been adopted during the previous, and subsidies, that's the word I was looking for, that were adopted during the previous term must be revoked, and that all kind of older subsidies must not be raised, and certainly tariffs must also not be raised, and there should be a moratorium for the remainder of the parliamentary term on any further new subsidies or tariffs. If another country can do something cheaper and better than we can, then we should rather get that product from them. The South African consumer should not be a pawn in some game between two governments in a trade war. I think another thing just to mention here that the EFW includes is financial independence. So in 1933, the proto-apartheid government, the United Party, adopted exchange control regulations, and those remain in force today. And still you have to go through a long process with the Reserve Bank to take some money out of the country. It's not the place of government to tell you where you may or may not put your own rands, and we think that it's beyond time for that low-hanging fruit of apartheid era law and policy to be done away with. Finally, regulation, it's a big topic. We've identified a few items here that are of note. I think the most important one is we believe in the right to work. Unemployment is South Africa's biggest problem, and the solution that the Free Market Foundation has been punting since the early 2000s is that a job seeker's exemption certificate should be introduced, and we still very firmly believe in that. All credit, of course, to FMF Director Eustace Davey for leading the charge on that. Effectively, this certificate would allow job seekers who have been unemployed for an extended period of time to say, you know, I'm ready to work, and I don't want the protection of labor law anymore, thank you very much, and they would exempt themselves at their own initiative from the application of certain labor laws and regulations, and in so doing be able to find work on a contractual basis exclusively with prospective employers. Then, of course, there's healthcare. The NHI Act was just adopted right before the election, and many people are saying that is why the ANC lost its majority. I'm not so sure, but that certainly needs to be done away with. The right of the individual to determine their own healthcare affairs is so intimate and so basic and so fundamental, not just to our freedom, but to our dignity, that it's quite horrifying that any government feels comfortable saying that, listen, you don't get to make this choice anymore, or in time you won't get to make this choice anymore. We as the NHI fund will take care of that for you. That is just an injustice that must be done away with. And in its place, we've long advocated for low-cost benefit options to be allowed for health insurers and health medical schemes to offer low-cost products to the indigent. Currently, they are not allowed to do that. And then finally, education. I don't want to act like it's last but not least. The Bella Bill, the Bella Act was just adopted into law, and that very famously takes away the authority of school governing bodies in public schools and transfers that to provincial education departments. That is not the way to go. Parents and teachers will always know better than faraway bureaucrats what is best for a given school, and we think that the the status quo ante bellum, as it were, should be restored, and that the Bella Act should be done away with. And then just as a general principle for future policy, the government must keep its hands off of home education and off of private education. The Constitution is very particular about what the government is allowed to do when it comes to independent education. And that is, if there's racial discrimination or the standards are lower than public schools, then the government can intervene. That's it. But of course, our government has gone far beyond that, and we think that that is definitely not the right way to go. So just to conclude on the booklet, these reforms are nothing, these are not our ideas. They have been shown globally to work. Freedom works, as one can say, and it works for the poor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So yeah, the 4 principles that the Free Market Foundation dedicates itself to: individual liberty, free enterprise, private property, and limited constitutional government. These really kind of encapsulate what the recipe for success is, and they underlie our philosophy when we adopted this book. And yeah, the title "Liberty First" I think is an important play on words. Everyone's talking about South Africa first here and America first there. Let's forget about the statist ideas about nation states and about specific people prospering, and say that, listen, actually liberty is the transcendent principle that enables all of that. You don't have to put anyone before anyone else or anything before anything else. Just put liberty first and all the good things follow. And that's just a quote from one of our intellectual lodestars, Friedrich von Hayek. The argument for liberty is an argument against the use of coercion to prevent others from doing better. And that is ultimately what all overregulation comes down to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Is this working?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Martin. And I thought that was a succinct summary of some of the core policy recommendations. I'd encourage you to check out the document yourself. And I think that this is a good segue into our conversation on the panel. We'll take questions from the audience in just a moment. But Morne Milan, what would you say about specifically that first pillar around the size and scope of government? I mean, I think one of our concerns here is that the GNU, Government of National Unity, is going to mean more big government. Martin mentioned this point about how last year we advocated for a shrinking of the size of government. But now all the parties want their ministries in their portfolios. So we're a bit concerned about the ballooning size of the state. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, David, when you break it down, the GNU sounds pretty bad. Government, we'd like less of that. National, we'd like less things to take place on a national level. And unity, I suppose it depends on what you're uniting around. The ANC seems quite clear that they expect everybody to unite around their vision. But I think your point on limiting not only the size but also the scope of government, the scope being the amount of areas within one's everyday life that government encroaches upon and coerces one to do, to limit your choices in terms of what you'd like to do. But another point which I think is perhaps underemphasized is just the importance of the size of government, and the main reason for that being, particularly in South Africa, is that we are actually entering a very dangerous situation with regard to debt. There is, when you look at a graph of South Africa's debt to GDP, you see that since 2009, you have almost this perfect hockey stick where in the 2000s it was around here, around 2008 it was there, and then it just shoots up. So it was around 32% in 2008. It's now at almost 80% of GDP at the moment. And even within the last 5 years, since 2020, the budget balance has been negative 5% on average for each year. And the outgrowth of that is that at the moment, the second largest item within our budget is debt. debt servicing costs. So not paying off the debt, but paying the interest on the debt. It's gotten to the point where every morning when we wake up, that's just over R1 billion of debt that the government pays, well, of interest on the debt that the government pays. So it's just over, we're at around 380 billion rand in debt servicing costs, the second largest item in the budget. Just to compare that to some of our emerging market peers, they're at around 8% of their budget, whereas we're at around 20% of our budget. So a fifth of our budget is just paying interest. And it's not because we've got a revenue issue, because in terms of tax to GDP, we're actually quite high. It's not ridiculously high. There are countries that have higher taxes than we do, but there are also countries that have higher services for those taxes than we do as well. So in terms of tax to GDP, we're standing at around 25%. The global average is 15%, so we are significantly higher than the global average. We're actually taxing at the same level as countries like Sweden, the UK, like Luxembourg, so we're taxing like Sweden, but we're servicing like Somalia? And then just the last point, and then I can hand it over to you, David, is just on the wage bill. One of the points that we raised was reducing the size of government, making sure that there are less not less government employees, but that those government employees that are not needed, that are not strictly necessary, that don't require tax money, that they don't receive it. And once again, the wage bill represents about a third of our budget. So between the wage bill and the debt service costs, we've gone over more than half of the budget. So government spends around 2 trillion rand every year. Just over half of that is going towards either servicing the debt or paying wages. And just to put that in perspective, it's not that we have that many government employees. We're sort of equal with the OECD in terms of the share of general government workers versus the share of the labor force. But in terms of the compensation, so the wage bill versus the GDP, we're completely above average. Well, not above average, but out of whack with what would have been the norm. Above average seems a bit too positive. Just to put that number in perspective, Norway has the highest proportion of its workforce in government. They're around 30%, which is fairly ridiculous. But their wage bill is around 11% of GDP. We have around 18% of our workforce can be classified as general government workers, but the wage bill represents around 14% of our GDP. So a higher proportion of GDP for a significantly lower amount of government workers. And I don't think I have to elaborate on the quality of service that we're getting for the tax money that we're paying.
Yeah, and I think politically that's going to be very interesting, because prior to the 29th of May, a lot of contestation, for example, around government wages or government posts took place within the Tripartite Alliance. The COSATU, as a labour federation, was advocating and lobbying for this increased scope of the size of the state as well. So now you've got this other component of other parties that need to be consulted. Are we going to see the aggressive cutbacks on state spending? I'm a bit doubtful about that, right? There's going to be a lot of accommodation and compromise that's going to be happening at the political level.
Well, perhaps, Martin, you'd have a better notion of, I reckon that we're likely going to see, I think it's going to be a difficult decision between either continuing with the norm or dissolving the GNU, but maybe I'm being a bit too pessimistic, but that is typically one of the most, one of the points at which will be contested the most.
Yeah, and I think something that to be aware of as a risk is the consensus-seeking approach that the president has tended to favor will just reproduce the status quo, right? But the figures that you just quoted to us now require dramatic action immediately. Like we're not in a long game scenario. We need to make these cuts to government spending now. We need to reduce the debt now. We need to close that fiscal gap now. Martin, do you have anything briefly to add on that?
Yeah, I think an important aspect here is that our finance minister hasn't been terrible on this. So at least while he's kind of dragged by the collar by his colleagues to do the things that they want, it does seem that he has a sense of things cost money. And this is very rare in the South African government. And I think whatever government is formed, it's important with new cabinet colleagues to kind of support that sentiment and kind of bolster that view. But not only in government. So if you paid attention to the public discourse last year when there was some whispers that some spending might be cut, like it's terrible. It was complete and utter hysteria in our press, and people just going completely mad. And only a few voices like the Free Market Foundation said, listen, this is an opportunity, this is a good thing. Let's see the positive side of potentially reducing the scope and the size of government. And that would be certainly not just for the finance ministry and for cutting the size of government, but really all positive noises potentially that come from the GNU or whatever coalition follows. The public really needs to kind of say, yes, this is a good thing, let's do this thing. Rather than feeding the hysteria that often comes from a very kind of specific sect of our chattering classes. So I think we need to be aware of that aspect. You know.
Yeah, so, I mean, we at the Free Market Foundation are non-partisan. We care about liberty. That's why this paper is called Liberty First. But we obviously take a very strong interest in what's happening at the political level. We'd like to see far less politics in South Africa. But we do observe it very closely, and it does have a big impact on our lives in this country. And so we, as the FMF, have been one of the few voices that have advocated for what we call a no-elition, a confidence and supply agreement. And this is an alternative to the grand big tent GNU approach, right? Martin, maybe we'll go to you on this. What was some of the reasoning behind our argument there? And also, how does this concept of confidence and supply actually work? What does that mean in practice?
Yeah, so just briefly on what confidence and supply is. This is something that's done around the world as fairs for a parliament. Basically, an opposition party minister or your presidential candidate, we will not vote you out of government when there is a vote of no confidence. We will actually make sure that your cabinet stays in power. And we will approve the annual budget so that the government can actually continue functioning. That's kind of confidence and supply stripped to its most basic. Some people would say that you can spice it up a little bit and ask for a little bit more, so maybe the opposition party gets a few parliamentary roles, chairs of committees and so forth, maybe the speaker. But ultimately it comes down to the opposition party does not join the plurality party in government. It keeps the plurality party in government as a minority government, and the opposition party remains in the opposition and continues to play that vital role in a constitutional democracy of being an opposition voice. And that is ultimately why we supported no elision, because we are in a situation in South Africa where over the last 10 or so years, our politics has been radicalizing, and in the midst of such a high temperature of politics, David says we at the FMF want less politics. That's certainly true, but the very opposite has been happening. So much more of our lives is being politicized. Need is the old Liberation Party in government.
from red tape to red carpet, where they identified, I think it was about 300 laws in the city of Cape Town that were anti-business. And the idea was to dismantle those laws. It might be very difficult for a GNU to pass any new laws, but there is scope for removing laws, especially regulations passed by ministers. Are there particular areas where if the DA were to be in certain ministries and have the ability to revoke regulations, where would you like to see that happen?
I'll just give a brief answer and then I'll hand over to Mornay. I think if you're talking about regulation specifically, trade and industry. I think that's the clearest thing. I struggle to think about labor, like we talk about labor regulation, but that's usually the law. So I think trade and industry, that's where you'll find your tariffs, that's where you'll find your subsidies, that's where you'll find your kind of competition commissions, operationalized findings and so on. These are all in the form of regulation. So I would pick that one.
So you don't need to pass complex legislation in the House with the balance of power there. You can just start striking things off with the stroke of a pen.
Yeah, and that is one of the advantages of not having one party in a dominant majority, is that Parliament has basically two functions. It's to make laws and to ensure that the executive is executing those laws. And particularly on that second part, we could see a GNU government, or at least a government in which the ANC doesn't have a clear majority, increase the pressure on the executive, and particularly if there are perhaps more liberty-minded individuals within key departments within the executive, then you could start to see a liberalization within specific sectors. Regarding which sectors? All of them, no. I agree with Martin, particularly on trade and industry, particularly with regard to competition policy, and also in the mining sector. It's been almost decimated. You've seen such a significant amount of consolidation that it's almost been ossified throughout the last couple of years. And likewise, when it comes to construction has, over the past 5 years, tanked in South Africa. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head now, but in gross fixed capital formation, South Africa has gone negative for years now, and the main cause is the fact that it's been impossible to construct any new buildings, residential, but in particular non-residential buildings.
I have many thoughts on that, but I see there are also many hands, so I'll hand over to you, Louis.
Good evening, I'm Louis Bossel from AfriForum. I have two hopefully straightforward questions. The first would be, do you think the DA would actually have been able to negotiate a confidence and supply agreement if they tried to, or do you think they simply hadn't any other good option apart from this government of national unity? And the other would be, in your booklet you referred to adopting Section 235 legislation that enables self-defined community formations and so forth. If you can just expand a little bit on that, what that would look like.
Yeah, so on your first question, the DA and all the partners kind of negotiating this thing are kind of keeping their cards very close to their chest. We're seeing very little communication from any of the parties about what's happening. Like you get something from journalists every now and then, and that is where someone said something that I found very peculiar, and that's Carol Payton, the journalist. She said that the ANC told the DA that they would prefer a confidence and supply agreement. So that is the only thing out there currently that I'm aware of. So the ANC wanted confidence and supply, and the DA said no. And this was confirmed subsequently by Tony Leon, who, as I alluded to earlier, kind of dismissively referred to confidence and supply as this kind of half-pregnant fallacy. It's like it's not really an option. You're either in a coalition or you aren't, which is, it's bizarre coming from the man who saw the New National Party. He bore witness to what happened to the New National Party when it went into a full coalition with the ANC and was eventually absorbed by the ANC. So I think yes, they would have been able to negotiate confidence and supply, because I think the ANC was very open to it. That's all dependent on whether Carol Payton and Tony Leon are telling the truth. I don't have any original sources. Then the 235 legislation, that's very interesting. We've never had Section 235 legislation adopted in South Africa. Professor Pierre de Vos, a so-called constitutional expert, he says that during the negotiations to end apartheid and during CODESA and so on, Section 235 was part of the smoke and mirrors to kind of get the right wing to shut up, and like that was just thrown in there. It's like it doesn't really matter. It's like just it's basically stillborn, and the constitutional expert. But no, we constitutional supremacists believe that if the Constitution has words in it, those words mean something. And Section 235 of the Constitution very simply says that Parliament may adopt legislation within a defined territory within South Africa that allows linguistic and cultural communities to exercise self-determination. So it's framed very broadly, and therein lies my excitement about it, because that allows you to kind of say that, listen, this is a broadly formulated provision, so in fact these communities can engage in almost kind of federal self-determination, provided they're still within the Republic of South Africa. So one could think of the Ngonyama Trust and the Zulu monarchy. That could be a perfect example of Section 235 legislation that says, yeah, you are now the monarch of this community, you can have your traditional prime minister, and you can govern yourself within defined areas within KZN. There's various other examples. I think Orania is a very good example in the Northern Cape. Small community, kind of very easily definable, has been engaging in self-government for many years already, and to kind of make that de jure law would be good. I think the Freedom Front Plus is currently trying to negotiate something like that for Orania. They're also holding their cards very close to their chest. But yeah, I mean, you can see this Section 243 really kind of releasing some of the pressure of everyone together in the centralized state of South Africa. It could really allow a lot of people to get on with kind of ruling themselves without worrying about who's in the center. So it's a provision in the Constitution that I'm quite excited about.
I think we would very much still advocate all South Africans to adopt an attitude of state-proofing. No one from the central government in Pretoria is coming to save you. We've been saying that for years, and it's still the case. We'd certainly welcome a more reform-minded government, but I think it's up to us to also rebuild from the bottom up some of our broken institutions and to preserve our way of life in this country. Monet, do you want to add anything there?
I actually just want to ask Martin a question. And if Peter Vos is right that the intent of the legislator in that case was merely to placate the right-wingers, does that mean when interpreting 235, we have to give it as a right-wing interpretation as possible?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's a pity that neither Pierre de Vos nor Tony Leon are here to defend themselves, but they're certainly welcome. But yeah, interestingly enough, in Tony Leon's excellent memoir, on the contrary, yeah, there was a moment where Mandela actually approached him to become Minister of Public Enterprises, and he rejected it because he didn't want to be co-opted into the government. And that decision actually enabled the DP and later the DA to grow massively in that void that was created on the opposition benches by the departing NP. Yes, we had Richard, and then we'll come to Tony.
Thanks very much, David. I'm Richard Wilkinson. I'm a lawyer and previously worked as legal advisor to some DA mayors in Gauteng. I really enjoyed what David just said about state-proofing yourself, and that no one's coming to save you, and that we all need to be fiercely independent. And I was also interested in, I think, what Martin said earlier about how he regards the South African Reserve Bank as having discharged its mandate successfully over the last couple of decades, and that the currency is one of the things that the ANC has actually conserved quite well. So my question is about currency. And my concern is that the Reserve Bank might not be able to withstand some of the pressures that are going to be placed upon it due to poor fiscal governance. My question is, what is the FMF's opinion on Bitcoin, considering that it is a limited supply currency of only 21 million coins? Nobody will ever be able to produce more than 21 million. I'm wondering whether you take it seriously or whether you regard it as being a bit of a joke. If you do take it seriously, do you have a recommendation for what South African governments should do with their reserves? So potentially the national government, but I think more realistically, I'm referring to local municipalities where the DA is in government, which might have some cash lying around. Well, there's basically only one, that's Cape Town. Do you think they should store their money in rands, which might be diluted, and have the purchasing power diluted in years to come, or do you think they should be storing their reserves in hard currency, either perhaps Bitcoin? And if you do take Bitcoin seriously, what do you guys do with your own reserves? Do you have them sitting in rands, or do you have them sitting in Bitcoins? Thanks.
Excellent question. And yeah, I think we're very bullish on Bitcoin. And just on the point of the South African Reserve Bank, and that is precisely the risk of having a central bank, is that it becomes a site of potential political capture. And yeah, you can have constitutional protections, as Martin pointed out. But there are enormous political pressures to really loosen the money taps. And that could trigger massive inflation and really erode the buying power of ordinary South Africans. And inflation is almost like a form of tax. Inflation is very high now, but wait till you see it after Julius Malema gets hold of the Reserve Bank. So yeah, as you say, Bitcoin is a very important alternative store of value, this question of monetary debasement is something that is affecting even rich countries, and we saw during COVID and all the way back to the global financial crisis, huge amounts of monetary quantitative easing and fiscal dominance as well, where governments are using monetary policy as a tool to finance ongoing large deficits. Mornay mentioned South Africa's own debt to GDP ratio, which is pretty high historically, but compared to some other countries, it's fairly modest, right? Including in the United States, where I think 40% of all US dollars that have been created into the system have been created during the last 3 years, basically. So, and that, because the US dollar is an international store of value, a reserve currency, you don't see some of those inflationary effects. And that's not just reflected in CPI, but it's also, if you look at the cost of education, the cost of housing, that is ballooned exponentially. So to your question around Bitcoin adoption, we, on our roadshow that Martin mentioned, we stopped off in Mossel Bay at Bitcoin Ekasi, which is a fantastic project around Bitcoin adoption in low-income areas. And the entrepreneur behind this is Hammond Vivier, and his sole focus is on getting low-income individuals in the township in Mossel Bay using Bitcoin as a day-to-day medium of exchange. And he's onboarded spaza shops and the small retailers, barbers, and so on in that area. And he runs a surf training school where young people go and they learn how to surf and they teach tourists how to surf and they get paid in Bitcoin, right? So, and I think his name is Michael Saylor. He's also been doing a lot of work in the US around corporate treasuries adopting Bitcoin as a formal component of their treasury, right? And I think very important there is that you have security, not your key, not your Bitcoin, as they say, as a hedging strategy against a major debasement of the rand. I would say that is very important. I think the payment infrastructure around that is still lacking in sophistication, and so there's a lot of work to be done there in building additional layers to that protocol. But I think you're absolutely onto something. I think local governments should be pursuing this line very seriously. That was a bit of a long answer, but Mornay, do you have anything to add to that, since you're doing a master's in monetary policy right now?
No, but David, I think you summed it up quite well. I think the focus at this point should be to clarify and to liberalize access to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies for the populace. I have actually haven't thought about governments using it as a store of value. I'm not entirely sure that it would be a good deal, well, it would be a good thing for Bitcoin to be involved with our government. I think cryptocurrencies can only have their reputation ruined by greater involvement with our government. But it's a enticing idea. And yes, with regard to the public, I think there are some really good initiatives, and I think the most important thing is just to ensure that everybody understands what the rules are and that those rules aren't too intrusive and that they allow people to access this technology.
Yeah, I mean, countries like El Salvador have adopted Bitcoin as well, and they actually have it as an official medium or an official currency. But you don't need to do that. You can just start using it. I should also insert the necessary caveat that we're not financial advisors, so please do take your own risks.
Yeah, just the most important aspect of this is that since about a month ago, the Free Market Foundation is also accepting Bitcoin donations. So please browse over to our website and you'll see the little bee icon following you around very annoyingly. And please click on it and open your digital wallets to us. Thank you very much.
Yes, we want your sats because we're stacking sats here at the FMF. There were other hands, which, yes. Yes, we are.
Thank you, David. I'm Tony Hampson-Tyndale. Morne, you mentioned about the exponential increase in borrowing over the last 10, 12 years. Apart from funding a bloated civil service and apart from the money that's been stolen, we're not seeing much in the way of civil work. So where has this money gone to?
And I think after this we'll have one last question and then we'll wrap up.
Look, the civil service is a significant portion, and I don't think you can underestimate the impact of corruption. And then, of course, particularly recently is the persistent and pernicious, and this also connects to what Martin was saying about the state-owned entities, but the necessity to continuously recapitalize the state-owned entities. Off the top of my head, I think the figure for the last 5 years, or since 2019, is around just under 300 billion in recapitalization for state-owned entities. So, I mean, when you're spending 300 billion rand merely on getting state-owned entities to a point where they're not so insolvent that they can't operate, then, I mean, that doesn't leave much room for spending on anything helpful. So that certainly doesn't help. Corruption is an enormous issue, and it's not just an issue at national level, it's an issue throughout the spheres of government, but maybe especially on a local level. But yeah, it's almost hard to define or to narrow it down to any specific cause.
Yeah, and Morne, if you consider that municipalities owe Eskom north of 50 billion rand, it's probably even higher now. And some of those municipalities will never be able to pay off those debts. These are the kind of difficult trade-offs and big discussions that are going to have to be characterizing the next government. All right, are there any last questions? We have the last question here.
Thank you, David. It's Richard Meyer. I'm a labor lawyer, and I was just interested in your job seekers exemption. Obviously, there will be a lot of resistance to that amongst the labor movement. And what in particular would be exempt? Would it be the unfair dismissal jurisdiction, the minimum wage, or are there any other aspects that the job seekers exemption would seek to exempt employers from having to comply with?
Yeah, so we, as a policy think tank with a bunch of people with a very clear value statement, we always go in and demand what the ideal of what we would want. And as far as we're concerned, the JSEC must enable a job seeker to exempt themselves from the whole field of labor law except the common law. So basically everything except what has been recognized over many years and decades as the bare minimum protections for a worker. But the reality probably is that if this concept is adopted, there will be some haggling over what exactly is it that you will be able to exempt yourself out of. And yeah, we'll need to see what that is. Certainly the sectoral and national minimum wage is something that we would say should be probably very high on that list. Certainly the process of dismissing. I mean, I think that is something that really causes a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, to just balk at the idea of appointing anything resembling a large labor force, because they know that if you appoint these people who might initially seem to be up for the job, you cannot get rid of them easily enough. And it's important to be able to get rid of people out of your business, because in a dynamic labor market, people go between jobs as a matter of course, and it's not the end of the world when someone is fired. But in South Africa, it is the end of the world when someone is fired, because our economy has been ground to such a halt that having your one job is basically your only kind of lifeline, and then if you lose that, then there's nothing left. So certainly when we talk about we need economic growth, we mean that there needs to be a lot more jobs available so that this dynamism can occur. And dismissing people, the ability to dismiss someone without going through a 2-year-long process in the CCMA and the labor courts would be very high on our list of things that should be included in the JSEC, but ideally the whole field of labor law except the common law.
Yeah, and I think that's the tragedy of the last decades, is that the government has simultaneously tightened its grip on the labor market and restricted the ability of employers to hire and fire. But at the same time, they have these youth employment schemes like the YES program, which are sort of these palliative mechanisms that really just deal with unemployment at the margins. And I mean, Mornay mentioned the minerals and energy complex in South Africa. I mean, South Africa is blessed with a very rich mineral endowment. We have 90% of the world's platinum. We have massive coal deposits. We have new natural gas discoveries, as James Lorimer, the DA MP, has been speaking about. So if we can make those regulatory changes, get mineral rights back into the hands of entrepreneurs and invite foreign investment to come in, we will just see an absolute incredible boom in those industries, and job creation follows that. I think we've gotten used to, lamentably, low economic growth in South Africa. We've lost sight of the potential. But we're here to change that with our policy recommendations, and also with your help. To those of you who are watching back home, if you want to help us, Martin mentioned that you can donate to us in Bitcoin as well as fiat. We still accept the fiat currency. And you can also help us by liking this video and sharing it with your friends and family. And I just also wanted to say a special thanks to you, our audience here at Northwoods House, for joining us and for the excellent questions, typically very high standard of questions that we've become used to here. But I want to invite you now to come join us for some refreshments. And if you're not on our mailing list, please do speak to us and we'll make sure that you get future invitations. That's it from me, David Ansara, Martin van Staden, and Mornay Milan. Until next time, stay free.